Infographics often have a certain look to them. You can sort of spot them from a distance. Infographic design language is very important. Before we get there, though, we should remind ourselves of one important thing. Everything depends on our audience. We need to know our audience specifically. We need to know sort of how they would like information designed to them. If there are certain sort of aesthetic choices that would work particularly well for that audience. And we also always have to know what we want to say to them. What is the point of this? And how can I communicate that? There are so many options for design choices. Color, the types of images, the layouts and fonts you want to use. One thing before we talk about any infographic-specific design is remember, be consistent. Consistency establishes your design language. Those design choices say a lot to your audience because those cues are sort of immediately interpreted as somebody starts looking at the visual information of your infographic. We could design that same slide, for example, like this or like this. And each of these is going to sort of position the audience differently towards my information and do different things with that information. Here, perhaps doing something infographic-esque, using icons with the titles themselves can help it cement in my audience's mind a bit better. So although there is a wealth of general design issues and advice about choosing a color palette, wanting to use coherent fonts that aren't all different, there are some infographic-specific things that I do want to talk about. The first is the use of icons, then we'll talk about structuring, and finally, the visual mode of communication. So, when people are building data visualizations on infographics or putting sort of visual markers, they usually use icons. So sometimes things do look a little bit cartoony, but generally the aesthetic of infographics is relatively flat and iconographic. Icons are in contradistinction to clip art. If you are ever curious if your icon of a sun has sunglasses on, you found clip art. Clip art tends to be a little bit more whimsical, a little bit more comical, and in general, that's not the tone you want to set on infographics, especially ones that you're creating for a class. However, the caveat is always know your audience. If I'm creating an infographic for kindergartners, I'm going to use some clip art. The next thing to talk about is structuring. Structuring infographics often comes through the bold use of color and color blocks. Here, we use color blocks in a few ways. We use color blocks to separate each step. This square with rounded corners easily separates out each of these 8 steps. But you'll also notice that we use color blocks in a different way to separate the body and the footer. We have a light blue background for the color block for the top, which says this is the body content. This is the main thing. And then we have a footer, which is its own tan color block that separates it from the main body area. You also need to pay attention to negative space, often called white space, although it's not white here, in order to structure your infographic. You see that we have consistent and fairly generous negative space on the sides here. It makes things feel not cramped, and it actually makes those 8 steps in the middle sort of feel like they go together even more, as they're proximally related. We also observe consistent white space between all of those elements in order to make sure that they look separate and not crammed together. Another thing that infographics do is make sure that your primary mode of communication is visual. They should be visually appealing. And here I'm using an infographic on eating healthy, specifically from the Office on Women's Health, in order to highlight a way that many infographics often don't. So here they are using icons, they have bold colors. You see them trying to section things out, like using negative space between the sections reading down, a color block at the top for eat healthy. However, even though there are some data visualizations in here, really text is the primary mode of communication. You need to make sure that you don't allow text to overtake your infographic. You will necessarily have some, but you need to make sure that that's not the primary way that you are going about communicating. So, In order to sort of emphasize these key concepts, you should be always asking yourself if, looking at this infographic from a distance, is your organization clear? Can you tell where things are, what information goes together, where the title is, what is sort of the body content, and then maybe the footer content? Also, how are you using your various design strategies, spacing you use, the colors you use, fonts, icons, sizing of those icons, in order to aid your audience's readability? How are you making this information accessible to your audience through your design? When you privilege that audience perspective, you're well on your way to making a very well-designed and effective infographic.